my name is Dr. Chloe Hamza, and I'm very pleased to be here speaking with you today as part of this global speaker series. So to start today, I want to share a quote with you from a student who recently participated in one of our research studies. And they said, for someone who self-injures, I think that university is a huge trigger. I stopped doing it for years, and then I came to U of T. And in my first year, it started up again as a direct byproduct of the stress that schools puts people under, and especially the grading. I wanted to share this example with you because I think it really brings to life what I'm going to be speaking about today, which is stress, emotions, and non-suicidal self-injury in the post-secondary context. So more specifically, over the course of this presentation, I'm going to provide a brief overview of non-suicidal self-injury among post-secondary students. And then I'm going to highlight why the post-secondary years may be associated with heightened vulnerability for non-suicidal self-injury. And I'll present an example of a research study we've done in my lab to illustrate this point. So broadly, when we're talking about self-injury, the term self-injury could be used to describe any behavior that is performed with the knowledge that it can or will result in some degree of bodily harm. Non-suicidal self-injury, or NSSI, in particular, refers to direct and deliberate damage or alteration of bodily tissue that is performed without lethal intent, such as self-cutting or burning, and for purposes that are not socially or culturally sanctioned. So, for example, NSSI would not include tattooing or piercings. We know that NSSI most often has its onset in adolescence, typically around 13 to 15 years of age. But we know that the early adult years are also a period of heightened vulnerability for NSSI. And this is also a time when many young adults, particularly in industrialized countries, attend post-secondary school. So just how prevalent is NSSI among post-secondary students? Well, our best estimates that come from consolidated data around prevalence suggest that as many as 20% of students, or 1 in 5, have engaged in NSSI, with a large majority of post-secondary students with a history of NSSI reporting that they've engaged during their time in university. There's also some indication that rates of NSSI might be higher among emerging adults in post-secondary school relative to same age peers who do not attend post-secondary school, which I think really underscores how important context is for understanding risk for NSSI. Now, it's challenging to determine whether rates of NSSI have increased over the years because there really is a lack of large-scale epidemiological data. But we do know that referrals to college and university health centers for NSSI have increased, at least if you look at data coming out of Canada and the US. Further, in my own cross-national work with the International Consortium on Self-Injury in Educational Settings, we've shown that the majority of college and university stakeholders, so students, staff, faculty, perceive or think that NSSI is increasing. Again, it's difficult to determine to what extent this reflects, increased rates of NSSI, or whether we're seeing increased awareness of this behavior, perhaps as rates of help seeking have increased with advances in mental health stigma reduction. Nevertheless, I think this work really speaks to just how common NSSI really is on college and university campuses. Engagement in NSSI confers heightened risk for a variety of aversive outcomes for students, including academic underperformance, other mental health challenges like depression and anxiety, as well as risk for suicidal behavior during the later university years. So, for example, in my own research, we've shown that students who have a history of NSSI are 4 to 5 times more likely to make a suicidal attempt during the later university years. Clearly, understanding the processes through which NSSI is initiated and maintained are really important to early NSSI prevention and intervention on post-secondary campuses. So, to prevent NSSI, we really do need to understand why students engage in this behavior. Now, theoretical perspectives on NSSI have long underscored the affect regulating properties of NSSI. And there is now a large literature to support the contention that NSSI is used primarily as a form of emotion coping behavior. For example, when we ask students why they engage in this behavior using self-report surveys, students often say that they engage in NSSI to reduce stress, anxiety, and self-directed anger. Similarly, if we measure students' emotions before and after engaging in NSSI using real-time sampling, which is a method in which we actually signal to students to report on their NSSI in real time, several times a day, over several days or weeks, we find that negative affect or negative emotions tend to increase prior to NSSI, and at least in some studies, decrease following the act. So, although converging evidence suggests that NSSI is commonly used as an emotion regulation strategy, less clear are the processes leading up to engaging in NSSI to regulate distressing emotions, or an understanding of the reasons why some students choose NSSI and others do not to regulate their distress. One possibility is that exposure to stressful experiences may undermine emotion regulation abilities, leading to more persistent and intense negative affect or heightened emotional reactivity, which in turn could lead to NSSI for emotion coping. This might also help to explain why post-secondary students are particularly at risk, given that we know that the transition to university can be challenging for some students, right? They're managing new financial and academic pressures, potentially leaving home or their country of origin for the first time, and managing new social relationships. Now, it's also been proposed that students might be more likely to choose NSSI to regulate their distress if other NSSI-specific risk factors are present. In other words, this pathway may be stronger for individuals who also have other risk factors for NSSI. These risk factors could include having friends who engage in NSSI, such that if someone is distressed and learns about NSSI from close friends, they may be more likely to engage in this behavior relative to individuals who haven't had that exposure to NSSI. Diminished aversion to pain may also be relevant, such that if NSSI isn't regarded as particularly aversive, the likelihood that someone will choose NSSI when distressed might increase. Another risk factor would be negative self-belief, such as self-disgust, which might increase the likelihood that one is willing to enact self-directed harm. Now, although this model provides a useful framework for conceptualizing the processes through which NSSI might occur, there's been a lack of theoretically driven work on pathways to NSSI over time amongst students. So we sought to address this gap in our recent paper published in Frontiers in Psychology. And our purposes were really twofold. First, to examine whether exposure to stressful experiences in the post-secondary context increased risk for later NSSI through heightened emotional reactivity. And two, to examine whether this pathway was stronger for students who also had NSSI-specific risk factors. So for this study, we surveyed 1,125 undergraduate students at the University of Toronto 3 times during their first year of university, so the fall, winter, and spring. And at each assessment, participants reported on the extent to which they experienced several stressors, such as getting lower grades than they hoped for or not having enough time for sleep. Participants also reported on their emotional reactivity, so emotional intensity, sensitivity, and persistence. And then they also indicated the extent to which they engaged in several NSSI behaviors. Now, at time 1, we also asked participants about 3 NSSI-specific risk factors, including whether they had close friends who engaged in the behavior, their levels of self-disgust, which were our sort of marker of negative self-beliefs. And then finally, we also asked participants about their fear of pain as a proxy for pain tolerance. We used path analysis and M+ to examine associations among stressful experiences, emotional reactivity, and NSSI across the 3 waves. And our model included autoregressive paths amongst variables, cross-leg paths between variables, while also taking into account associations among variables within each assessment point. And then we examined the moderating effects of these NSSI-specific risk factors. In our sample, we found that 25% of students reported a history of NSSI at baseline, so 1 in 4. As expected, we did find that greater exposure to stressful experiences predicted increased risk for NSSI through emotional reactivity. However, contrary to expectations, this association wasn't stronger for folks with the NSSI-specific risk factors. Those students who engaged in NSSI did report having more friends who engaged in this behavior and higher levels of self-disgust relative to individuals who did not engage in NSSI. So consistent with prior research, findings from the study suggest that NSSI is commonly occurring among post-secondary students. We found 1 in 4 in our sample. Given links between NSSI and other mental health concerns, as well as later suicidal behavior, early prevention and intervention is important. In our study, exposure to stressors during the transition to university was associated with increased risk for NSSI through heightened emotional reactivity, regardless of whether students had those other NSSI risk factors. We think these findings help to explain why the post-secondary years might be a time of heightened vulnerability for NSSI among emerging adults. Our findings underscore the importance of working to mitigate stressors for students on university campuses through fostering, a culture of care on campus, for example, as well as teaching students strategies for managing stressors during the transition to university. Moving forward, I think we have a lot more work to do on understanding and addressing NSSI among post-secondary students. First, I think it's really important that we continue to try and study pathways to NSSI. So for example, in my lab, we're continuing to try and understand which factors may increase risk for NSSI specifically to inform targeted prevention and intervention. So in a subsequent study, we're assessing more potential NSSI-specific risk factors and examining the extent to which a combination of these factors together may be better at predicting which students will use NSSI when distressed. We also think that some risk factors may be more relevant to NSSI onset versus maintenance, and our study didn't specifically examine this. I also think examining NSSI among more diverse student populations is a really important future direction. So for example, how does something like minority distress impact NSSI risk? And or how might other socio-ecological or sociocultural factors impact NSSI trajectories among post-secondary students? Finally, I think that my work also underscores more generally the need for a campus-wide approach to addressing NSSI in the post-secondary context. Given that we know that the early post-secondary years may be a time of heightened risk, I think we really need to think about how we build mental health literacy, reduce stigma, and support help seeking, and then ultimately build campuses in which there is effective NSSI response and support for students. To conclude, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of the members of the CARE Lab, the collaborators on the works mentioned, and the funding agencies that have contributed to my work, including SSHRC and CHR. I'd also like to extend a huge thanks to all the students, staff, and faculty who've participated in our research. And of course, a thank you to you so much for your time and attention today. I've also included my references for you to access in the recording after this presentation, and these are also available upon request from me as well. I look forward to discussing this work further with you in the Q&A. And if you're interested in our research, I would encourage you to check out our lab website, thecarelab.ca, or find us on Twitter. Thank you so much for your time and attention.